Sister Margaret arrived at the community center on a chilly Saturday morning, walking with slow and careful steps, as if every movement carried both weight and purpose. She wore a simple, well-worn habit that had faded over time, and her small figure looked almost swallowed by the crowded parking lot and busy entrance. To anyone watching, she seemed like someone who did not belong in the lively, modern event that was taking place inside. Yet she held a quiet determination in her walk, the kind that suggested she was not here by accident. Inside the building, the atmosphere was loud and energetic. Teenagers and young adults rushed around carrying instruments, adjusting costumes, and talking excitedly about their performances. This talent show was a big deal for the small town, a chance for local youth to show their skills and hopefully record something impressive for social media. Bright banners hung from the walls, speakers blasted upbeat music, and colorful lights flashed across the stage. It was a place designed for energy, confidence, and showmanship. When Sister Margaret stepped into the registration area, the noise seemed to swallow her. She waited patiently in line behind contestants dressed in flashy outfits and bold makeup. A pair of boys practicing dance moves nearly bumped into her, barely noticing her presence. She simply smiled, stepped back, and allowed them more room. She didn't complain, she didn't remind anyone to be careful. She behaved like someone used to being overlooked. At the registration desk, a young volunteer glanced up, surprised to see her. He checked the list, expecting she was a visitor or perhaps a relative of someone performing. But when she softly said she wanted to sign up to perform, he stared for a moment, unsure if she was joking. He looked over her shoulder, almost expecting to see someone nudging her forward as a prank. When he realized she was serious, his expression shifted from confusion to awkward politeness. He handed her a form, not knowing what else to do. "A name?" he asked, still uncertain. "Sister Margaret," she answered with a gentle smile. He wrote it down, but his eyes kept flicking up at her face as though trying to read her intention. She completed the form slowly, carefully writing every answer, making sure her handwriting was neat and clear. When she reached the line asking for her talent, she wrote the word piano, and the young volunteer raised an eyebrow. He had heard singers, dancers, rappers, comedians, and even magicians sign up that morning, but an elderly nun entering for a piano performance didn't fit the usual lineup. As she stepped away from the table, two girls nearby whispered and giggled. They weren't trying to be cruel, not intentionally, but they couldn't help themselves. They imagined her fumbling on stage, playing clumsy nursery songs or forgetting notes halfway through. They joked about the audience pretending to enjoy it out of pity. Sister Margaret didn't hear their exact words, but she could feel the tone. She had lived long enough to recognize when people underestimated her. She didn't seem bothered. Her eyes moved around the room, observing the excitement with genuine curiosity. She wasn't angry at the noise, the jokes, or the flashy outfits. She didn't compare herself to anyone. She seemed to exist in a world slightly apart from theirs, calm while everything around her rushed. But behind her calm demeanor, there was history. Years of music held in her hands, years of practice hidden beneath wrinkled skin. No one there knew the decades she had spent teaching children, composing hymns, playing for services, and expressing faith through melody. They only saw an old woman, fragile and slow. Finding a seat near the edge of the room, she listened as contestants rehearsed. Some were talented, some nervous, some loud and overly confident. She watched their performances with genuine interest, nodding along to rhythms and smiling at gentle harmonies. She wasn't here to compete with them, she was here because she had something to give, something she hadn't shared publicly in years. As time passed, more people noticed her presence. Some stared curiously, others whispered. A few assumed she was lost and wondered why nobody helped her find her way out. The idea that she was here to perform seemed unbelievable to most of them. In their minds, talent shows were for the energetic, the young, the ambitious. Not for someone like her. Still, Sister Margaret remained undisturbed. She sat quietly, hands folded, eyes closed for short moments, breathing deeply as if preparing herself for something important but peaceful. The noise of the room didn't reach her heart. She had performed for thousands before: weddings, funerals, ceremonies, school events. She had seen laughter, tears, anger, and joy flow through music. She had watched people heal through sound. She had seen music change lives, but no one there knew that. To them, she was just a fragile outsider stepping into a world she didn't understand. When the host eventually called contestants for a briefing, everyone stood up and moved forward in one loud, playful crowd. Sister Margaret stood too, slowly, holding onto the armrest of her chair. One of the organizers, noticing her struggling, walked over to help. He wasn't mocking her. He genuinely assumed she needed assistance because of her age. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked kindly. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his arm for balance. "I'm quite capable, but getting started is sometimes the hardest part." What? He laughed politely, not knowing how deeply those words would soon apply to everyone in that room, because no one expected anything from her. No one imagined she would change the mood of the entire building. No one believed the quiet, old woman could silence laughter without saying a word. The audience was already restless when the host stepped onto the stage and announced that the next performer was someone named Sister Margaret. Many people looked around trying to see who that might be. Some thought it was a joke, maybe a comedy act or a parody performance. Others expected an elderly singer who would probably forget lyrics halfway. But when they saw the small, fragile figure of the nun slowly walking toward the stage, confusion turned into amusement. At first, the reaction was quiet, more curious than rude. People nudged each other, whispering things like, "What's she doing here?" Or "Did she get lost?" There was a sense of disbelief, as if someone had brought their grandmother to perform as a prank. A group of teenagers sitting near the front row laughed openly, bumping elbows and pointing. They had come to see exciting acts, not a frail, slow-moving nun. The host, who had been smiling brightly all evening, suddenly looked uncomfortable. He had been introducing energetic dancers, confident singers, and cheerful comedians with enthusiasm, but now he hesitated. He lifted the microphone again, unsure of how to manage the situation. "Sister Margaret, everyone," he said, forcing a polite smile. His tone carried a hint of uncertainty, almost apologizing to the audience. He didn't want to embarrass her, but he also didn't know what to expect. Some members of the audience clapped weakly, more out of politeness than genuine excitement. The sound echoed awkwardly through the room, quickly fading. A few people rolled their eyes, already predicting that the performance would be slow, boring, or simply uncomfortable to watch. The stage lights dimmed slightly, preparing for her entrance. Sister Margaret reached the center of the stage and paused for a moment, letting her eyes wander across the audience. What she saw didn't surprise her. She had known this would happen. She could feel the laughter, the judgment, and the disbelief in the air. But she didn't react to it. She didn't shrink. She didn't hurry. She simply stood, breathing calmly as if she had all the time in the world. Behind her, two boys whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Bet she's gonna sing church songs." Another replied, "Bro, she might fall asleep on stage before singing anything." They laughed, not realizing how loud they were. A few people nearby chuckled too, feeding off the same careless humor. It wasn't just teenagers either. A couple of adults shook their heads in amusement, thinking the organizers had lost control of the event. One woman whispered to her friend, "This is going to be embarrassing to watch." Another said, "They should have limited the age for performers." They spoke without thinking about how their words might feel if heard. The atmosphere had changed, not with excitement, but with a strange blend of curiosity and ridicule. People had already written the story in their heads. A fragile old woman out of place, making a fool of herself in front of a younger, faster world. But they didn't know the truth about her. They didn't know her history, her training, her years of dedication. They didn't know how many times she had played on stages bigger than this, how many audiences she had moved to silence, not because she demanded attention, but because she earned it. The stage crew seemed unsure too. A technician glanced at the host, as if asking silently, "Is this really happening?" The host shrugged, offering no answers. As Sister Margaret slowly approached the piano, someone in the audience tried to hold back a laugh but failed. The sound echoed abruptly in the quiet air. It wasn't just laughter, it was a dismissal, the kind people give when they believe nothing important could possibly happen next. The nun did not speak. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain what she planned to do. She simply moved toward the piano like someone who knew her purpose and didn't need the approval of strangers. More whispers floated through the audience, growing louder, turning into careless jokes and commentary. They laughed because they didn't understand. They laughed because they assumed weakness meant lack of talent. They laughed because it was easier than thinking deeply. But something else was happening too, something quieter. Not everyone was laughing. A few people watched with interest, not mockery. They sensed something beneath her calm expression, something that didn't match the fragile body they saw. One young woman in the second row leaned forward, unsure of what to expect but unwilling to judge too quickly. Backstage, a group of younger performers peeked through the curtains. They whispered to each other, predicting mistakes, imagining awkward pauses, expecting embarrassment. For them, talent shows were places to show energy, youth, and confidence, not humility and age. Even the judges sat in their seats with uncomfortable expressions. They weren't cruel, but they were doubtful. They wondered whether they should stop the performance early to avoid humiliation. One judge looked at another as if asking, "Should we let her play? Is this fair to her?" But no one said anything aloud. Sister Margaret finally reached the piano bench and sat down, moving gently, carefully. The microphone picked up the sound of laughter still echoing through the room. She didn't react, didn't look up, didn't frown. She simply closed her eyes as if gathering something deep within herself. What none of them knew was that this moment, the moment filled with doubt, mockery, and disbelief, was exactly the moment she had expected. Not because she liked being underestimated, but because she understood human nature better than most. She knew that people laughed at what they didn't understand, especially when it threatened their idea of what talent should look like. They thought she had come to entertain them, but she had come to teach them something entirely different. And soon the same people who laughed would fall completely silent, without being asked. Sister Margaret sat at the piano bench with slow, careful movements, but there was nothing weak in the way she positioned herself. She adjusted the height slightly, lifting herself just enough so her back would be straight. Her hands rested on the keys, not pressing, just touching lightly, as if greeting an old friend. For a few seconds she did nothing else. She simply breathed, steady and calm, letting her body settle into the familiar shape of a pianist. The audience, however, grew restless. People expected her to start playing immediately, or at least say something before she began. But she did neither. She remained still, eyes lowered, lips moving slightly, not speaking, just breathing. Some people thought she forgot what she came to do, others thought she was nervous. A few laughed again, whispering, "She doesn't even remember the song." The sound of quiet laughter floated through the room, not cruel this time but careless, but inside her mind there was no confusion or fear. She was preparing herself, not for a competition, not for applause, but for something sacred. For years, music had been her way of praying. Not loud, spoken prayers, but quiet ones made through melody. She believed that when she played, she was speaking without words, telling stories without sentences, touching hearts without asking permission. So before she began, she closed her eyes fully and lowered her head slightly. To the audience, it looked like a silent pause. But to her, it was a moment of connection. She whispered a short prayer, not asking to win, not asking to impress, but simply asking to be a vessel, someone through whom beauty could pass. When she lifted her head again, something subtle had changed. Her expression was still soft, still peaceful, but there was focus in her eyes, like a candle that had just been lit. She did not smile, she did not look around to check if anyone was watching. She already knew they were. The room was still noisy, but the noise had shifted. Instead of loud mocking, there was distracted chatter, footsteps, chairs moving, someone opening a bag of chips. People were not cruel anymore, they were simply uninterested, convinced nothing important was about to happen, because they judged her already. They assumed they knew the ending before she played a single note. One boy in the front row yawned loudly, resting his feet on the chair in front of him. A couple near the back scrolled on their phones. Two judges looked at their score sheets, ready to fill in low numbers before she even began. The host stood by the curtain, arms crossed, planning how quickly he could transition to the next act if she made a mistake. But there was one person who watched her closely, without sarcasm or impatience. A little girl seated beside her mother stared at Sister Margaret's hands. She didn't know much about music, but something about the way the old nun prepared herself made her curious. The girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "She looks like she knows the piano." The mother nodded absently, not really believing it. Sister Margaret inhaled deeply again. Her fingers, though thin and wrinkled, hovered over the keys with the familiarity of years of practice. They trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from anticipation. Playing piano was not easy for her body anymore, but it still lived in her bones the same way memories do. She pressed one key gently, not to start the performance but to test the sound. A soft note rang out, clear and clean. Some people looked up for a second, then looked away again. To them it was nothing, just a test, a warm-up, a meaningless sound. Then she raised her hands again, letting them hover. She waited, just a heartbeat longer, long enough to feel the silence of the piano beneath her hands. Long enough to feel the air of the room, even with all the noise. That small delay was enough to annoy a few people. "Oh my God, just start," someone muttered loudly. "Play something," another said sarcastically, but she did not rush. She had learned something long ago. When you rush because others demand it, you lose the heart of the moment. And she wasn't here to give them what they expected. She was here to offer what they needed, even if they didn't know it yet. She let her fingers fall to her lap for a second, resting. Her eyes softened, almost nostalgic, as if she saw not the audience in front of her but a memory from long ago. A memory of a church filled with people who listened, who didn't rush, who believed music was sacred. Then, without warning, she lifted her hands again and positioned them exactly where she wanted them. Every finger had a place. Every key had a purpose. She exhaled slowly, letting go of the weight of age, the noise of judgment, the fear of misunderstanding. In that moment, every wrinkle, every tremor, every year of experience was not a weakness, it was a story. A story waiting to be told through sound. She didn't need applause, she didn't need approval. She just needed a moment of courage, and that moment had arrived. Her fingers pressed down, not with force but with confidence. The first real note of her performance filled the air, soft yet powerful, so startlingly beautiful that even people who weren't paying attention turned their heads. They weren't ready. They weren't prepared. They didn't expect beauty from someone they had already dismissed. But she didn't need them to expect it. She only needed them to hear it. And with that first note, the world they had imagined began to crumble, quietly, slowly, one sound at a time. The first real note Sister Margaret played was soft, but it carried through the room like a whisper that demanded attention. It wasn't loud or dramatic, yet it somehow reached every corner of the hall. People who had been talking stopped for a moment, not because they wanted to listen, but because the sound was unexpected. They had prepared themselves for something weak, shaky, and unpleasant. Instead, they heard a note so pure and controlled that it didn't match the image they had in their minds. She followed that first note with a gentle chord, made of 3 soft keys blending together like a quiet breath. The sound wasn't rushed. Each note had space to exist, space to settle. Her fingers moved slowly at first, as if she wanted the audience to understand that she wasn't here to perform tricks or entertain with speed. She was here to speak through sound, to tell a story. A group of teenagers in the front row looked up, surprised. They had expected a messy, off-key performance that would fuel their laughter. But the music they heard was delicate, calming, almost haunting. The boy who had been joking earlier let his smile fade a little, unsure of whether to keep laughing or start listening. Sister Margaret's hands began to move more confidently, picking up a rhythm that was both gentle and full. The melody rose and fell like waves, not too fast, not too slow, just balanced, steady, and deeply emotional. The audience didn't understand the technical skill behind it, but they felt something change in the room. It was as if someone had walked through the crowd and turned down the volume of the world. The host, who had been waiting impatiently backstage, leaned out from behind the curtain. He didn't expect anything, but when he heard the music, his eyes widened slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just listened, confused by how beautiful it sounded. The judges, who had already prepared themselves to be polite but unimpressed, lifted their heads. One judge leaned forward, his pen paused in midair. He had heard many beginner performances, and he knew instantly that this wasn't one of them. There was no uncertainty in her movement, no hesitation in her hands. The skill was undeniable, and it came from someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone, only express something. The melody changed, shifting into something fuller, deeper. It no longer sounded like simple music. It sounded like memory, warm and painful at the same time. It was the kind of sound that made people think of something they lost, something they missed, something they wished they had said. Sister Margaret didn't need lyrics to communicate emotion. Her fingers knew how to speak. The people who had been laughing before now found themselves staring at the stage. The entire mood of the room shifted from mockery to silence, not the forced silence of politeness, but the silence that happens when people feel something without knowing why. She played a note that held for just a second too long, and a few people in the audience felt a lump form in their throat. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something close to it, something human. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a showy way. They moved like they remembered something precious, like they were chasing a feeling before it disappeared. There was a strength in her movement that didn't match her body. She didn't tremble anymore, she didn't seem old anymore, she simply seemed alive. The 2 girls who had laughed during registration sat still, watching. They weren't embarrassed by their laughter, they simply forgot about it. Music had replaced self-consciousness, replaced ego, replaced their need to be entertained with jokes. The little girl from earlier leaned forward, eyes wide, completely captured. She didn't understand technique or musical history, but she understood wonder. She nudged her mother again, whispering, "She's really good." This time her mother didn't give a distracted nod. She whispered back, "Yes, she is." Sister Margaret closed her eyes briefly as she played, not because she needed to, but because she trusted her hands more than her sight. Her fingers were memory. They knew where to go, they knew what story to tell. They had spent years doing this, years that no one in the room knew about. The music grew richer, louder, filling the room without overwhelming it. The audience was no longer restless. They were quiet, still, and strangely connected. Even people who weren't emotionally sensitive felt something shift inside them. The song wasn't about perfection, it was about honesty. And honesty was rare in that room. One judge swallowed hard, realizing she had tears forming. She blinked them away quickly, embarrassed to be moved by someone she had underestimated so quickly. She wasn't religious, she wasn't emotional, but something about the music made her remember her grandmother's hands, soft, tired, gentle, and suddenly she missed her. Sister Margaret didn't look up once. She didn't need to see the reaction. She knew when music reached people. She could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the way noise disappeared. For a brief moment, the room felt like a church, not because of prayer, but because of peace. A place where ego, status, age, and judgment didn't matter. A place where sound connected strangers. The last note she played in that opening section was soft again, a perfect circle from beginning to end. It lingered in the air, fragile and beautiful, refusing to disappear immediately. No one clapped. Not because they weren't impressed, but because clapping felt too loud for a moment like that. They didn't know what was coming next. But they understood one thing clearly: this was not a joke. This was not a mistake. This was someone speaking to their hearts, and they had no choice but to listen. The change in the audience was not sudden but steady, like a sunrise gradually replacing darkness. When Sister Margaret continued playing, the music deepened, growing more emotional with each passing moment. The laughter that had once filled the room seemed embarrassing now, even to those who had laughed the loudest. They did not know if they should look at each other or keep their eyes forward, afraid someone else might see the guilt on their faces. Her hands moved across the keyboard with a confidence no one expected. Each note flowed into the next, forming a melody that felt both old and new. It wasn't flashy or loud. It wasn't designed to impress with speed or force. It was honest, heartfelt, and painfully beautiful. It sounded like someone telling the story of a lifetime, of joy, loss, love, and endurance, without ever saying a word. As the music grew richer, the mood in the room changed. People who had been sitting comfortably in their chairs now leaned forward slightly, drawn in without realizing it. Their eyes followed her fingers, fascinated by how such fragile hands produce such powerful sound. Some watched her face, noticing the peace in her expression, the way her eyelids fluttered slightly when she hit an emotional note. The teenagers in the front row tried to resist at first. They shifted in their seats, tapping their feet restlessly, pretending not to care. But eventually, even they stopped pretending. The melody wrapped around them, leaving them without the energy to joke. One boy who had laughed the loudest earlier sat with his arms folded tightly, but his eyes never left the piano. The audience had come expecting noise, loud music, bold performances, dramatic moves. They expected to be entertained. But they didn't expect to be moved. They didn't expect to feel anything real. Yet here they were, silent, still, and strangely emotional, listening to a woman they had judged before she ever touched a piano key. The judges, too, felt the shift. One judge set her pen down completely, unable to write. She had judged performances for years, but she couldn't remember the last time she had listened without thinking about technique, mistakes, or scoring. She wasn't analyzing anymore. She was remembering faces, places, moments she thought she had forgotten. The music triggered something: nostalgia, longing, regret, hope. People remembered things they hadn't thought about in years. A childhood dream, a lost friend, a quiet moment with someone they loved. It was as if the melody opened a window inside everyone, letting old feelings escape. Even the host, still waiting behind the curtain, felt strangely emotional. He wasn't religious, he wasn't sentimental, and he definitely didn't cry easily. But even he rubbed his eyes once, annoyed with himself. "It's just a piano," he muttered, though a part of him knew it wasn't just that. The performance continued, and Sister Margaret didn't seem tired or tense. Instead, she seemed younger now, transformed by the music she created. The wrinkles were still there, but they blended with grace rather than age. The audience didn't see weakness anymore. They saw strength, quiet, humble strength that didn't need applause or recognition to exist. The room that once felt chaotic now felt sacred. People didn't cough, didn't whisper, didn't move unnecessarily. They were afraid to disturb something delicate. Even someone shifting in their chair felt rude. A gentle part of the melody rose, lifting the mood until it felt hopeful, even healing. The two girls who had joked earlier found themselves smiling, not at her but because of her. One of them wiped her eyes quickly, pretending she had something in her eye. Her friend didn't tease her. She was too busy staring at the stage, her face soft, her usual confidence replaced with something thoughtful. The little girl from before sat with her hands pressed together tightly, eyes wide and filled with wonder. She didn't understand why the music made her feel as if she wanted to cry and smile at the same time. She didn't understand how someone so old could play something so alive. She only knew she wanted the music to last forever. Sister Margaret leaned into the final part of the piece, letting her hands glide effortlessly, no hesitation, no fear. It was as if the piano was an extension of her body, as natural as breathing. She wasn't fighting the instrument. She was dancing with it. She was giving everything she had, not for approval, but because the music deserved honesty. The melody began to soften, slowing into something more tender. The audience sensed it was ending, and their hearts tightened, afraid the silence would return too soon. They didn't want to be released from that feeling. They didn't want reality to come rushing back. They didn't want reality to come rushing back. As she played the final notes, a quiet hush fell over the room, deeper than before. The last sound lingered like a promise, fading slowly until it disappeared completely. And when it was gone, no one moved. There was no applause, not yet. Everyone sat in stillness, almost in shock, overwhelmed by what they had just experienced. They didn't know how to respond. Clapping felt too noisy, too disrespectful. They didn't want to break the spell. For a long moment, the silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. The laughter, the judgment, the shallow assumptions. They all vanished, replaced by awe. People didn't look at her with amusement anymore. They looked at her with respect. And a little shame, because the woman they had laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated had just given them something priceless. a reminder that beauty, talent, and strength do not disappear with age. They deepen. When the final note faded and the room remained silent, Sister Margaret lifted her hands slowly from the keys, as if releasing something fragile into the air. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply rested her hands on her lap, breathing softly, her head slightly lowered. For a few seconds, she looked as still as a painting, untouched by the world around her. But the audience wasn't ready to move. They sat frozen, still absorbing the aftertaste of something they hadn't expected to feel. Some searched for words but couldn't find any. Others stared at the piano, as if trying to understand how such music had come from someone they had judged within seconds of seeing her. The silence was no longer awkward. It was respectful, heavy with emotion. But silence can only last so long before someone breaks it, and oddly, it was a very unlikely person who did. The boy from the front row, the one who had laughed the loudest earlier, leaned forward and whispered, "Wow." His voice was barely audible, but it sounded honest. Not sarcastic, not forced, just stunned. His friend nodded, eyes still fixed on the stage, unable to speak at all. That tiny whisper seemed to unlock the room. Slowly, people began to move again. A few shifted in their seats, wiping tears without making a scene. Someone coughed quietly, but not because they were bored, because emotion often feels like a tight knot in the throat. Then, unexpectedly, someone started to clap. It was just one person at first, a single pair of hands breaking the silence. The sound was small, gentle, almost nervous, but it was enough. Another person joined, then another. And soon the entire room erupted into applause, not loud or wild, but deep, sincere, and full of feeling. The applause grew stronger as more people allowed themselves to express what they felt. It was not polite clapping. It was grateful clapping. People clapped because they needed to, not because they were expected to. Some people stood up slowly at first, almost unsure if it was appropriate. But when one stood, others followed, until the audience changed from silent listeners to a standing crowd, honoring a woman they had almost rejected. A standing ovation for someone they had mocked minutes earlier. The host stepped onto the stage, his face flushed. He didn't know what to say. His usual cheerful confidence had been replaced by genuine awe. He raised the microphone, but for a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at Sister Margaret, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound cheap. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you for that." It wasn't the most poetic line, but it was honest. And honesty was better than performance. Sister Margaret lifted her head finally, her eyes shining with a light that matched the emotion in the room. She didn't seem proud or surprised or excited by the applause. She simply seemed grateful. She placed a hand over her heart and nodded slightly, acknowledging the audience without demanding their admiration. When she stood to leave the bench, someone gasped quietly. Not because she moved slowly, but because the spell felt like it would break the moment she left. But she did not rush. She stood with dignity, smoothing her habit with gentle movements, as if preparing herself to return to ordinary life. Backstage, the younger performers watched with wide eyes. Some looked intimidated, wondering how they could possibly perform after something like that. Their flashy costumes, bold routines, and loud music suddenly felt small. Not because they weren't talented, but because they had just witnessed a different kind of power, quiet, unshowy, and deeply human. One performer, a confident teenage girl with bright makeup, whispered, "I don't think I can go after her." She wasn't joking or dramatic. She was terrified of being forgotten, overshadowed by someone she never considered competition. Her friend shook her head, whispering back, "Nobody can follow that." Even the judges didn't know what to do. They stared at their score sheets, suddenly embarrassed by the little boxes and numbers. How could they grade something that felt more like a prayer than a performance? One judge scribbled out the scores she had started to write, feeling ashamed they were based on assumptions, not truth. The audience remained standing even as Sister Margaret began to walk off stage. Applause continued long after it normally would have ended. Some people clapped through tears. Others clapped with tight throats and soft smiles. A few bowed their heads, overwhelmed by something they didn't understand. When she reached the edge of the stage, she turned back not to take more praise, but to offer a small, quiet smile. It was barely visible from the back rows, but it meant more than applause ever could. It was the smile of someone who knew the world could be unkind, but still chose to give beauty to it. Before leaving, she placed her fingers on the piano for a brief moment, not to play, but to say goodbye. It was a gesture so subtle that only a few noticed, but those who did felt their hearts tighten. Because they realized something important: she hadn't performed to prove anything. She hadn't played to win, she had simply shared a gift. One that many people would remember for the rest of their lives, even though they had almost missed it. And as she disappeared behind the curtain, the applause finally began to fade. Not because people stopped caring, but because silence suddenly felt like the only respectful goodbye. Behind the curtain, Sister Margaret stepped into the quiet backstage area, leaving the loud applause behind her. The moment she disappeared from the audience's view, everything changed again. The open, emotional energy from the stage was replaced by nervous whispers, stunned faces, and scattered performers standing awkwardly, unsure of what to do with themselves. Some stood rigidly with their instruments, clutching them like shields. Others leaned against the wall, staring at her with wide eyes, not believing that the woman they laughed at earlier had just transformed the entire room with nothing but a piano and a calm heart. She didn't look at them with judgment. She didn't look at them with pride. She simply walked forward with gentle steps as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A young performer stepped out of her way too quickly, almost stumbling. She was terrified that Sister Margaret would notice her earlier laughter, terrified she would be silently punished with a cold glance or angry eyes. But instead, Sister Margaret touched her arm softly and said, "Excuse me, dear." Her voice was so kind that the girl felt tears burning behind her eyes. How could someone so gentle be the same woman who made an entire room feel like they were inside a dream? The host approached her backstage, still holding the microphone loosely. He wasn't smiling like before. His usual showman energy had vanished. He looked humbled, almost shy. "That was incredible," he said clumsily. "I don't know what else to say." Sister Margaret looked at him with the same softness she carried on stage. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm glad they listened." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit him harder than any dramatic performance ever had. Because he knew she wasn't talking about hearing notes. She meant listening with the heart, listening without judgment, listening without mocking. And for the first time all night, he wondered whether this talent show was meant to be more than entertainment. She moved toward a small hallway that led outside, and people parted to make space for her. They no longer saw her as fragile. They saw her as powerful, although she walked with the same slow steps she always had. Some tried to speak to her, but words got stuck somewhere between their thoughts and their mouths. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was respectful. Just as she was about to exit, a judge hurried toward her. She wasn't running to catch a star for a photo. She wasn't chasing a performer for attention. She just wanted to say something human before it was too late. "Excuse me," she said breathlessly. I wanted to tell you that your performance moved me. I'm not easily moved." She laughed awkwardly at herself, wiping her eyes as quickly as she could. "I don't usually cry at events like this." "What?" Sister Margaret smiled softly, her eyes warm. "Tears aren't a sign of weakness," she said. "They mean your heart heard something your mind didn't expect." The judge had no reply. She simply nodded, like a student learning something from a wise teacher, not an old pianist walking out the back door. When Sister Margaret finally stepped outside, the cold evening air greeted her, brushing against her face. It felt grounding after all that intensity. She stood for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the chill soak into her skin. She did not hurry home, did not check her phone, did not ask for results. She simply existed, content. While she stood outside, her mind drifted, not to applause or admiration, but to the early years of her life when she first discovered the piano. She remembered the old wooden church where she learned, the way the sound echoed in the empty hall, the way her teacher used to say, "If you ever have nothing else to offer the world, offer music." She wondered if he knew how long she would carry those words. Back inside, the talent show resumed, but the energy felt different. The next performer walked on stage, and though they tried to smile proudly, they looked nervous, almost small. The audience clapped for them, but something had changed in the room. People had tasted something real, something soulful, something without glitter and noise. And now, everything else seemed a bit smaller in comparison. Some audience members whispered, "She should win," even though they hadn't seen the rest of the acts. Others whispered, "I don't care who wins." For them, the competition was already over, not because she defeated anyone, but because she reminded them that competition wasn't the point. The teenagers who had mocked her earlier sat quietly, watching the next performers with less excitement. Not because they weren't talented, but because the boys felt guilty. They had spent so much time judging someone they didn't know that they almost missed something extraordinary. They weren't bad kids. They just hadn't learned yet that humility often arrives in unexpected clothing. The little girl remained seated, eyes sparkling, listening to every performer with a new kind of curiosity. She didn't know much about music, but she knew what she wanted now. She wanted to play piano like the old woman, not with perfect fingers but with a perfect heart. Outside, Sister Margaret finally began to walk away, step by step down the empty sidewalk. There was no fanfare, no spotlight, no one chasing her with microphones and cameras. Her footsteps were quiet, simple, ordinary, but behind her she left something unforgettable. A room full of strangers who would never again judge a soul by the shape of their body, the age of their hands, or the wrinkles on their face. A room full of people whose laughter had turned into silence, and whose silence had turned into respect. None of them knew where she went. None of them knew who she used to be, but all of them knew one thing: they would never forget her. Weeks passed, and the talent show became a memory that people in the small town could not stop discussing. At coffee shops, schools, and local stores, conversations kept circling back to the same moment. The old nun who walked onto the stage quietly and left it changed forever. Some people tried to describe the performance, but they always struggled to find words strong enough. Music had touched them in a way language could not easily capture. Videos of her performance began appearing online. No one recorded the entire piece, but some had filmed small parts of it secretly, thinking it would be funny to share later. Instead, those clips filled people with emotion, spreading across social media. Comments appeared from strangers around the world saying things like, "I don't know who she is, but this made me cry." And this is the sound of a soul speaking. Nobody knew her name beyond Sister Margaret. Nobody knew where she came from or where she went afterward. She had no social media, no online presence, nothing to prove her existence except the memories she left behind. In a world obsessed with being known, she remained invisible. And yet she was unforgettable. The talent show winners were eventually announced, and though Sister Margaret didn't officially win anything, people didn't care. Many felt uncomfortable when her name wasn't called. The winners were talented and deserving, but the audience clapped politely, without excitement. Everyone knew the trophy didn't belong to the best performer. It belonged to the person who played the game. And Sister Margaret had not come to play. Some audience members quietly protested, saying, "This isn't fair." But Sister Margaret didn't return to argue. She never showed up again. She never asked about results. For her, the stage had never been about victory. It had been about offering something meaningful, even if only for a few minutes. The teenagers who had laughed at her felt changed in ways they didn't fully understand. The boy from the front row who had whispered "wow" at the end found himself thinking differently about people. One day he said to his friends, "We judge people too fast." They laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond, but a small seed of maturity had been planted in them. The young performers who had been frightened of following her learned something too. Talent is not measured by applause or popularity. It is measured by what remains in the heart long after the performance ends. They practiced differently now, less focused on impressing the crowd and more focused on being honest with themselves. One afternoon, the judge who had spoken to Sister Margaret found herself walking past the community center. She paused outside and remembered the sentence the nun had said to her, "Tears aren't a sign of weakness. They mean your heart heard something your mind didn't expect." The judge repeated those words quietly, realizing they had changed something deep inside her. She had always measured art with numbers, but now she understood that some things are supposed to break the rules. The little girl who had watched the performance with wide eyes begged her mother to enroll her in piano lessons. Her mother hesitated, not wanting to force her into something that might become a burden, but the girl insisted. "I want to play like her," she said. Her mother smiled, thinking she meant skill, but the girl shook her head. "I want to play like she feels it." Those words surprised the mother because they came from someone so small saying something so profound. Some people tried to learn more about Sister Margaret, but they found almost nothing. No clear records, no photos, no history documented anywhere. A few older residents remembered an elderly nun who once played at weddings, funerals, and church events, but she had disappeared from public activities long ago. They said she tended to a small garden outside her convent, spent hours reading, and taught children music when she had the energy. She had lived quietly, giving more than she ever asked for. Slowly, the memory of her performance became something bigger than the event itself. It became a lesson, repeated through stories, a reminder not to judge someone because of age, appearance, or silence. A reminder that greatness often arrives without announcement. Years later, people would still say, "Do you remember that night?" And they would smile not because it was funny, but because it was beautiful. Even the teenagers, now grown, carried a gentleness that came from a lesson learned too young to appreciate immediately. One evening, the host of the talent show sat alone on that same stage, where lights and laughter had once filled the room. He ran his fingers over the microphone stand and remembered the moment he stood speechless after her performance. He still couldn't explain what happened that night, but he knew that he had seen something pure. Meanwhile, somewhere far away from all the noise, Sister Margaret moved through her days with quiet purpose. She watered flowers, helped in the kitchen, and prayed with the same calmness she had carried on stage. She never knew about the videos or the conversations or the lives she had changed. She never knew that strangers cried because of her or that her performance had become local legend. She didn't need to know. She had given without expecting anything in return. She had offered music like a gift left on a doorstep, anonymously, lovingly, and without asking for credit. And that is why her story stayed alive, not because she tried to make it last, but because truth has a way of surviving on its own. People often say legends are built from fame. But sometimes, legends are built by someone who walks quietly, touches hearts gently, and leaves before anyone can say thank you. Sister Margaret didn't take anything from the world, she gave something to it, and the world strangely felt changed because of her.